And if Israel goes full force ahead, what do you think? They're not going to use the hostages to try to stop that? They'll do anything to protect themselves. I'm talking about the enemy. And now there is something on the table. Another thing that I must mention that infuriates me, to be very frank, is the idea that instead of the world calling, Hamas did a terrible crime, atrocities. They took innocent hostages in addition to those atrocities. The call should be, return all the hostages. Why is this become now, they're doing us a favor? We have to thank them that they're coming to the table to return the hostages, as if returning the hostage is a gift. It was a crime in the worst possible way. But you don't hear that. And that's a really sad situation. That creates a whole different, distorted standards here. And that was also something that Rebbe battled. Because something is lacking. You have to feel you are the winner. You are standing up for the right and the truth. There's nothing true about the other side. There's nothing to negotiate here. They're killers. They call for killing. They've done it. And they're saying they'll do it again. And they have hostages right now. So what needs to be called is ultimate total surrender or total eradication. That is the emphasis. That is the best way I can convey what I understand from the Rebbe's approach, which, as I say, the Rebbe is not just invoking the Rebbe. The Rebbe spoke al pi seichel, al pi Torah, meaning al pi halacha, which all comes together. You have chokhmah b'goyim tamim, but there's also Torah, and you need both. And when you take them both together, you get a clearer picture of the whole situation. Okay. So another few questions around that. Let's just talk about that. Are the small groups of hostages slowly returning to Israel a microcosm of the future ingathering of the exiles? Every time a Jew is saved, there's some form of geulah, yes. But it's hard to say it in this context because there are other hostages, and as I just elaborated, there's a war. I'm reading the question because you asked it, but I think you have to also put things into context. If all the hostages were released, even that, so back to square one. It's not like, we're talking about here people who are mamish in danger. In general, the Rebbe spoke that when Jews bechlal returned to Eretz Yisrael, whether it was from the Soviet Union or other places, is a form of a beginning of kibbutz golus, or a sign of it, a beginning signs of it. But that's as much as I would say. I wouldn't associate kibbutz golus with the release of these hostages, because we are leaning a lot more at this point. Okay. Can we compare Hamas to Pharoah in their persistent shifting positions regarding releasing the hostages? In yeshiva, I was taught all the miracles that happened during Yetzias Mitzrayim will happen again, during Golus Mashiach, but on an even grander scale. Another clue that history is repeating itself is when Pharoah played games and said, I will let your people go, and then kept changing his mind and saying he won't let us go. And then he finally let us go. We know the next step was Geulas Mitzrayim. Yesterday, the Hamas terrorists were playing the same games of psychological torture by saying they will let 13 hostages go. Then they kept changing their mind, saying they won't let them go. Finally, they let them go. So if we recognize the patterns, we know the next step is Geulas Mashiach. Well, we hope so. And we believe so. But I don't know about this association. As I said, I'm being very cautious and careful not to make these comparisons too literal, because as I said, there's a middle of a war right now, and I think we have to keep focus on the bigger picture here. Yes, as I said, the celebration of those released and their families we all share with. But, Pharoah, the Golus Mitzrayim, yes, Pharoah was ultimately forced and he gave up. That's what we're hoping for. So that's where I would make the comparison. I wouldn't start making the comparison to every detail because I don't want to give Hamas even that credence. Would be yes, that they give up all the hostages and they surrender completely or are completely destroyed, then you can make the comparison to Pharoah. But beyond that, I don't know, Pharoah is not the Hamas, and are there similarities? You could always find similarities in every battle. But that's as far as I would go. Okay. But I do appreciate that people are thinking about the geulah even in these darkest events and trying to find it. So that is beautiful to see, and we should continue thinking that way. Next question, which is in the same spirit, how to ensure that a war brings peace? Only through strength. A war is what we don't want, but when you are fighting a war, you don't fight a half war. You have to have goals and meet those goals. Either eradication of the enemy, especially the enemy that provoked this in the first place, or total, as I said, unconditional surrender on your terms, on the winner's terms. This is something that the Rebbe emphasized all the years. And this maybe is the crux, like I said before, the lack of the kememirs, of standing strong without conviction. Remember, most wars are lost on psychological terms. It's not lost necessarily in the battlefield. If the enemy can weaken your resolve and your commitment, that's even worse than losing a physical battle, a military battle. So that's the answer. That's how war brings peace. I'll be speaking more about this throughout the week, the different programs and classes that we do, which again, as I said, go to meaningfullife.com. We have a calendar of events, and the themes are around topics. So one of the focuses about this, about war and peace. And ceasefire is a very interesting word, but not every ceasefire brings peace. If the enemy remains an enemy and wants to kill you, just because you stop shooting doesn't mean they don't want to kill you. So things have to be done with, again, context. Okay. Let's now go to Yud Tes Kislev and then to the parsha. What can we learn from Yud Tes Kislev during this time of war? So the truth is, I spoke about this literally last week, what can we learn from Yud Kislev? And honestly, I would say the same thing. So I'm not going to repeat everything I said, I just refer you back to last week's program, but I will say briefly. Yud Tes Kislev was in Tov Kuf Nun Tes, but later, Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel, the year of the Istalkus of the Alter Rebbe, we know the Istalkus came part result of running away from Napoleon, who the Alter Rebbe opposed and prevailed that Alexander should win the war. But they say the Alter Rebbe lost years because of that, because of his victory to make sure Napoleon loses. The Alter Rebbe would have lived longer had that not happened. That's what it says in different places. She sees the Alter Rebbe was not just teaching Chassidus. I say just, it's not the right word. But Torah Chassidus is also global. Torah Chassidus came to change the world. Called Bidur HaUmis, refinement of the nations. And the Alter Rebbe at the time felt and realized that the Eden were not ready to go into the Western world because of the challenges that freedom would provide. So it was still a time of that, even though physically they were more oppressed under Alexander of Russia, but spiritually they'd be more intact. But then the Rebbe says 7 generations later, now we are ready. Which of course is the story of this week's parsha, Jacob and Esau, which we'll talk about shortly. So the Yud Tes Kislev, which is Chag geulah, and the geulah in the form of Pada B'Shalom Nafshi, and the Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus, is captured in the story that happened, the Russo-Franco War in 1812. Because Chassidus comes to change the world. And that's when Alter Rebbe was released Yud Tes Kislev, we see in his letter that he writes to Rabbi Yisroel Baditchev, he says, you see, the Einei Kol Ha'amim, and the Sari Melucha, and all the nations saw, and the ministers saw, open miracles. And the Rebbe asked a big question in the early Mems, Mem Beis, Mem Gimel, Mem Dalet, Yud Tes Kislev. Why, of all things, Yud Tes Kislev was a geulah of the Alter Rebbe, a geulah of Chassidus, a geulah of Torah, a geulah of a tzaddik. What's the negay here that the nations were impressed? Why do we care about the nations here? So he said, because the whole point of Torah and Chassidus is to transform the nations. And Yud Tes Kislev was a netzachin absolutely for Eden and for Torah and Chassidus, but it was also a netzachin with the purpose of Torah, Bidur HaElam. So when they see it, it affects them. That means it's fulfilling the mission. This was the time when the Rebbe began strongly in the Mems, talking about Sheva Mitzvah B'nei Neach, which, as I mentioned before, now is that wake-up call. So here, when we're coming to a Milchama going on in Eretz Yisrael, in Gaza, in that whole area, so every Milchama is connected, and we're looking for a geulah, a pada b'shalom nafshi, with shalom. So Torah Chassidus comes into play because Torah Chassidus' purpose is to win these battles. in a peaceful way, or whatever way. In a peaceful way. And when you need to fight a physical war, it's a physical war. And the goal is, again, not just to eradicate the enemy, not just the Alter Rebbe should get out of prison, but that the nation should recognize the significance of this nitzachon. The nitzachon of Eden, of elikus, of godliness, of what the Eibishter wants in this world, of Eretz HaKadosh, Kedusha, to all the people. Yud Tes Kislev's message is very direct. And our learning Torah and our learning Chassidus is meant to be not just for a select group, it's for the entire world. Molo Aris Deis Hashem Kamayim Leyam Mechasim. And Lo Yerei V'Lo Yashchisa B'Chol HaKodshi. There will no longer be evil and destruction because Molo Aris Deis. Molo Aris, the whole world. As the Rambam says, Lo Yisa Kol Ha'elam El Ladasas Hashem Bolvad, which clearly means all the nations of the world. Including Muslims, including Christians, including Buddhists, including everybody. But Eden, he talks about that Yisroel will be Chachomim, as he describes there. But this is meant the transformation of the world, and that's what Chassidus came to be. So Yud Tes Kislev has a direct connection. So this, let's segue into parsha Vayishlach. So in the Sichos of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe brings it in the Sichos of Vayishlach, of parsha Vayishlach. Yud Tes Kislev always comes out in parsha Vayishlach. He says that parsha Vayishlach is the story of Birur of Tehu, because Esau represents Tehu, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Torah Er, the Birur of the physical world, Ishmael Chama, Yedid Sayid. So he says in the Sichos that Yud Tes Kislev came to be Mevara the Eretz, the Var Elam Tehu. So what's the story we find in this week's parsha? Jacob and Esau, that began in parsha told us. L'umalum Yam, it's two nations. Zekom, Zekom Zenefel, which is essentially Malchus Edom. Esau is Edom. The Western world, the Roman world, the Christian world. And Yaakov, his twin brother. Ishtam Yeshiv Aholim. The battle between the Nefesh Alikis, Nefesh Abam is the divine soul and the animal soul. The battle between the two nations in a cosmic and a broad level that have been going on for thousands of years. Then Yaakov escapes Esau's wrath, gets married, builds a family in Choron, as we discussed in Parsha Vayetze. Now he comes back, Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim, he wants to know, Vu halt Esav, where's Esav holding? The Rebbe brings and emphasizes that Yaakov thought that maybe Esav was already refined and we're ready to go to the geulah. At Kedei Kach, ready to go to the geulah. Vayishlach Tov Shemem Zayin, especially, the Rebbe talks about it at length, relatively. But then, when they come back and they say that he's walking with 400, Esav is marching with 400 men, he realizes he's not ready yet. You can imagine the disappointment. He thought after the Birurim he did with Lavan, after the time, the 20 years that passed, but wasn't ready yet. So that's when he prepares to daven, prepares for war, and prepares a bribe and to appease him. And he ultimately succeeds with the tefillah and the appeasement. Story continues. That night he moves over his whole family over the river, goes back for the pachin ktanim, because he's going back to the last sparks on his end, and he meets the angel, the malach of Esav, the son of Esav. Very cryptic, mysterious man that they wrestle all night until the morning. And the wrestling angel cannot prevail over Yaakov. What he does is he displaces his hip socket. And that's why we don't need Gid Anosha, as the pasuk says. Yaakov would not let him go. The angel says, I have to go. It's in the morning. No, bless me first. And that's when he blesses Yaakov, that your name will no longer be Yaakov, be Yisroel. You've battled people and Elikim, an angel of God, and you've prevailed. With many interpretations in that itself. Then he finally meets Esav, and they do indeed embrace the two opinions, complete embrace, not complete. But there was an embrace even for that moment that Esav was not yet ready for geulah, but he did embrace. And then he says to Yaakov, so now let's lift side by side, let's come with me. And Yaakov says, no. The sheep are too tender, the children are too weak and young. You go ahead, I'll come slowly. And Rashi explains, what does that mean? He says, he will ultimately come, when Mashiach comes, v'hoisel Hashem amlucha. That's the story in brief. So, of course, if you think about it, it's mamish the story of our times. The Alter Rebbe opposed France, Sarfas, which was Edom. That was a threat, even though Russia was also Edom. But that's another discussion, but definitely that Edom was a threat. And then the Rebbe says in Vayeshev Tavshun and Beis, after 7 generations, we're ready now. We're ready to embrace. We're ready to transform the world. So the Medrash Lekach Tev says, what was the wrestling that all night? So it says that's the wrestling that we didn't go through all of golus, the night of golus, until the morning when the geulah comes. The Ramban says that wrestling and then the hip displacement is the displacement and the pain suffered by all tzaddikim through the generations, all the Yisurim that Eden would endure was all a result. That was the wound. He could not prevail over Yaakov, win over him, but he wounded him. And the end of the story is that geulah will come and Esau will be transformed. So even though it's not talking about Yishmael, but we know from the Maimorim that the last birurim, in the Maimor of Tafri Samaches, Pesach Maimorim, and Tafshin Tes, from the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the last birurim will be, and many other places, Esau and Yishmael. So in general, it's both of them, and ultimately will be geulah. V'hoisel Hashem amlucha, Hashem, which includes Esau and Magdil Zuremi as the last Rashi in this parsha talks about, and includes Yishmael in the broad sense as well, that they'll all be nizbarer. That's called birer umes. Oz epech halam im sofa brura, as the Rambam also brings the pasuk from Tzfanya. So we see here how the parsha is talking about events of our times, with the end, of course, being a beautiful end. So just to read a few questions around this more specifically, once I gave this overview, it says like this, let's read like this. How does this Torah story of Jacob and Esau's reunion help understand today's events? Well, I just explained that in detail. It explains it in the general context of the battles, l'umalum yematz, and what will be at the end of the story. If the wrestling match between Jacob and Esau's angel represents a spiritual battle between good and evil, could it be said that during today's war, there's a simultaneous spiritual battle occurring between Netanyahu and the angel of Hamas? I wouldn't necessarily say Netanyahu, I would say Klal Yisrael. Yeah, that is exactly correct. I don't know if it's the angel of Hamas, but it's definitely Hamas and everything it represents, as we just discussed, the wrestling. But the end of the story is Yisroel. So he says, so what is the significance of Yaakov changing his name, Yaakov's name being changed to Yisroel, and our country being called Eretz Yisrael instead of Eretz Yaakov? Exactly that. Yisroel, that's the power of Ha'id. We hope it shouldn't come through battle, but if it has to come through wrestling, it comes through wrestling. And who gives us the name? It's actually coming from the enemy. The ultimate is Sapche. Now what we want now is the full healing of the rib, of the dislocated hip, I should say. And we want, well, it says Yerech Yaakov, sometimes it says hip, sometimes it says rib. But we want the total geulah, and it should be the Alei Sashach in the morning, and that's the geulah, like the Medrash says. Okay. So with that, we covered the parsha. There's a few more questions on the parsha. Just looking at what I'm covering, what I'm not covering. So let's just do this. A note has been going around social media that says the IDF on a mission in Gaza recovered the body of a woman named Yehudis from Kibbutz Be'eri, and is being shared with a pasuk from Bereshis 26:34 that says Esau took a wife named Yehudis, a daughter of Beeri. I'm not sure if this is just a coincidence or a prophecy, but my understanding is the descendants of Esau became Rome, and the Western world, and the descendants of Ishmael became the Arabs, including those in Gaza that did the kidnappings on October 7th. So I'm not sure whether Esau fits into the current situation. Can we ask Rabbi Jacobson for his intuition on what this pasuk could mean in today's situation? Thank you. Well, in general, to find connections between names of people today in the parsha, if I heard it straight from the Rebbe, it's one thing. If not, I would stay away from too much specifics. The general picture, yeah. There's a remez, so it's interesting to note, and thank you for pointing it out. I'm not sure what we can learn from it. It's a tragic situation if she was indeed found killed, God forbid. But it goes back to the general lesson, yes, that the story then is the story today. The events that happened then, Ma'aseh Avos Simul Abanim, in a way it foretells what will happen. With the key thing is to emphasize what we should be doing about it in a positive way, through adding in our mitzvahs and adding in light and transforming the world and transforming Esau. But I would stay away from too specific because that becomes sensational, and who's to say, you could always fit things into everything. That has to be said by a true authority. They're going to make such connections. And finally, someone writes, can we learn a lesson from Shimon and Levi to guide us what to do in Gaza? The Torah says the prince of Shechem violated Dinah, but Shimon and Levi didn't just bring the prince of Shechem to justice, they killed every male civilian in the town of Shechem. We know that the Hamas terrorists committed the massacre, but we also have a video of civilians in Gaza making a parade and cheering for them as they returned to Gaza city October 7th. Perhaps Shimon and Levi were teaching us a lesson that not only the perpetrators need to face justice, but those who support and cheer them on also need to face the sword. This sword of iron. Well, again, can you learn a general lesson that you have to sometimes go to war? Yes. But we also know Shimon and Levi were aggressive and somewhat criticized, even though what they did was at the end of the story correct. So I don't know if we could just take that and lift it and say that's what applies today. That needs to be done through military strategists, and no one's interested in killing civilians, innocent people, if there is such a thing. The interest is to win this battle against all the enemies. It could be all the people in Shechem were guilty. It could be many people are guilty in Gaza. But I think this is more than just looking at the lesson and saying, okay, go kill everybody in Gaza, 2 million people, because Shimon and Levi killed everybody in Shechem. So you have to do what you have to do. Hopefully, as I said, we can get them to surrender completely, and true surrender, and eliminate that. The same goal the same accomplishment as if you would eradicate them, and anyone that supports them. Many civilians in Germany may have been innocent directly. It was a minority that controlled, but it was the Nazis that came to power and were elected. But as a fact, they took hostage of their entire country. So I'm sure some innocent Germans were killed. Many were not so innocent. They were complicit in their silence in other ways. It's hard to say. We don't know every person what they did. God knows. So that's how I would look at it. But we are told the story because it's all told at times you need to do what you have to do, as painful as it may be. You can't just be passive in the face of crimes like this, especially by people who are saying they're going to do it again. Okay. Again, I feel frustrated that I cannot really address everything that was asked. Just time runs out. And new questions keep coming in. So, what I say is that we will continue this discussion. Hopefully we don't have to, because this will be over the Eibusha Shav Nachmanis already, on Klal Yisrael, on every Jew, and this should come to an end, and we should march to the geulah even before Yud Tes Kislev, even before the conclusion of Yud Dalet Kislev, and in a shalom dik way, Pada b'shalom nafshi, in a peaceful way, with the release of all the hostages, unscathed, and b'chlal, as I said, march to the geulah mitzvah v'ashleim, enough is enough. But meanwhile, we have to do what we have to do. Derech HaTeva, that's also part of what the Eibusha gave us keiches to do, May it be in the most peaceful way. May it be with the least amount of pain and aggravation. And may we all have a real Chedesh geulah. This has been My Life Chassidus Applied. We're here every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. And everyone be well and healthy. And may continue Le'yonav Le'ish Hashem Yisroel everywhere in the world, and especially in Eretz Yisrael.
This program is brought to you by My Life, Chassidus Applied. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at chassidusapply.com/donate.